consumed, when adoration becomes obsession. When one thinks of a great artist, they most likely think of someone like Picasso or Da Vinci. Artists who are, obviously, highly respected for their work. What defines art itself as good? Gets a bit trickier, however. While art is predominantly deemed good for more readily apparent reasons like technical skill or more profound reasons like the meaning behind the artwork, an angle that's a bit more overlooked is what makes a piece of art good to the artist who created it. Two pieces I'd like to talk about, Babette's Feast and The Menu, 2022, I believe provide a solid answer to that question as well as discuss why it matters. Babette's Feast is a short story first published in 1950 by Karen Blixen under the pen name Isaac Dinesen, primarily focusing on two sisters, Martine and Philippa, and their newfound maid, Babette, who, after years of serving as their cook, wins the lottery and spends the winnings on a lavish feast for the sisters and other residents of their remote Norwegian town. In heavy contrast, setting-wise and tonally, Mark Mylod's horror thriller film The Menu, 2022, primarily focuses on Margot, an everyman protagonist at an isolated high-end restaurant run by Chef Slawik, a jaded and highly esteemed chef whose experimental, almost performance art dishes in his 9-course meal turn more deadly and cynical over the course of the night. With a modern setting and a complete whiplash in genre/tone, it seems entirely unrelated to Babette's Feast at first glance. However, I believe the works explore many similar themes and ideas, albeit through different lenses, particularly through the characters of Chef Slawik and the titular Babette. One of the most immediate similarities between the two works is the idea of creation and a love for making art, with both works exploring the idea of creating art being a generous giving to the world. While both Babette and Chef Slawik possess a strong love for cooking and a true love for cooking, Slawik has an almost obsessive approach to cooking, with many of his dishes in the film serving as a sort of lashing out against those who will, in his eyes, never truly understand his work. The third dish featured in the film in particular, the breadless bread plate, shows an interesting contrast to Babette's titular feast, with Slawik serving a bread plate consisting of nothing but minuscule portions of condiments and a note describing the high quality of the bread they will not be eating tonight. While Babette shows generosity even to those who were distant to her, Slawik would prefer his patrons to effectively starve than to serve them unappreciated art that turns to S-word inside their gut. The Menu, 52 minutes and 6 seconds. Tyndall 2. Despite Slawik's dishes seemingly being made out of hatred, Slawik himself claims that love is the most important ingredient. The Menu, 1 hour 29 minutes and 27 seconds, in his dishes, and while at first it seems like a cliché statement, he's most likely telling the truth. In his eyes, he settles for nothing less than perfection for a crowd of people that don't enjoy his art the right way, despite his renown and adoration, even while his later dishes turn into those like his fourth course, The Mess, where the introduction to the dish consists of a chef shooting himself in front of restaurant patrons, with patrons later applauding the man's great acting. Babette, on the other hand, prepares a feast with all of her newfound wealth for those who swear to take not thought for food. Blixen 13. Just because the art created in her cooking is great, however, this is more overly restrictive. Temperance on the villagers' part, Babette still created despite not knowing if it would be appreciated fully, if it at all. While Slawik feels he's wasted his life by creating for others, the mere act of creation gives Babette joy, with Babette stating she's done it for her own sake. Blixen 20, in regards to the creation of her feast, meant solely for those around her. Babette and Slawik are fundamentally similar characters that are almost two sides of the same coin. Both are characters that come from troubled pasts, with Babette being forced to flee France, and Slawik originating from a broken family. Both are skilled artists who take heavy pride in their work, and both heavily invest in one final meal. The most notable difference between them, however, is that while Babette chooses forgiveness and generosity, Slawik chooses wrath and spite. While it's important to note that Slawik's rage primarily stems from the fact he feels his art isn't fully appreciated, which is partially true in some cases, like the trio of snobby bankers that only dined at Slawik's restaurant for notoriety, with one stating that at least they can say they've been here. The menu 2049, if an artist lets their obsession of perfection and how their art is perceived overshadow the joy they experience making it, at what point do they begin to effectively not enjoy creating it? If an artist doesn't enjoy creating art, do they still love the art form? Slawik himself is later confronted with this in the cheeseburger scene, a scene you've most likely heard of even if you haven't seen the menu, and a scene in which I believe the film's message shares the closest similarities to those presented in Babette's feast. While trying to escape Slawik's restaurant in the latter half of the film, Margot finds a photograph of Slawik from what appears to be his first job in the restaurant industry, a fry cook position at a chain burger restaurant. This photograph is the first time we see Slawik smile in the film. This escape attempt fails, however, and shortly after Margot ends up at Slawik's restaurant once again, Margot confronts Slawik on his dishes throughout the night, claiming Slawik cooks with obsession, not love. The menu 1 hour 29 minutes and 36 seconds. A statement that would render Slawik's constant qualms about his work not being respected near hypocritical. Slawik responds to this by asking what Margot truly wants, to which she asks for a cheeseburger, the dish Slawik made regularly at his first restaurant job when he seemingly still had a true love for cooking. Slawik himself prepares the cheeseburger, the first time in the film we see him personally prepare the food served, as opposed to his kitchen staff in the first time in which the camera shots focus on the actual Tyndall 3 cooking of the food and not the presentation. Margot takes one bite, compliments the dish, then asks to be allowed to leave by requesting a to-go box, a request which would be seen as insulting in most fine dining restaurants. Slawik allows her to leave before serving his final course of the meal, which includes burning down his restaurant with all staff and guests, including himself, inside the building, leaving Margot the only surviving character in the film. The cheeseburger in this represents passion, the passion for cooking Slawik eventually lost as he grew jaded and perfectionistic. By forcing Slawik to confront his lost passion, Margot mimics Babette's view of creating art for the sake of creation. Slawik's obsession and festering hatred has not only robbed his art, but also himself. While others contributed, ultimately, a majority of the emotions that led to the events of the film were his doing. It's clear Slawik recognizes this. Despite continuing his murderous and suicidal final dish for one main reason, he allowed Margot to leave. He recognized she was right, that his joy was lost, and thus he effectively failed to make good art, and in her recognizing this, Slawik understood that Margot understood his art better than he did, with understanding of his art being the main thing he claimed he wanted from his customers throughout the film. Despite their lack of effectively any similarity at first glance, the menu tells a very similar story and shows heavy overlap with those in Babette's feast, albeit with a different path taken by the artist character and through a much darker lens. While Babette's feast shows a direct admiration for the love of creation, and the menu shows how an artist can feel when obsession overshadows that love, the message is ultimately the same between the two works, that the greatest joy an artist can find in their work is the sheer joy in creating it, whether they use that flame inside them to cook or to burn.